Okay, we are live talking about the Frogger episode.
It takes you away. It took us a little while, but we're getting to it.
Yes, what?
Edward was gonna be here, but stuff came up, and so he will be back once we get back to talking about Torchwood and Series 3.
Yeah.
But for now, we're talking about this episode, which Lucy and I had very different reactions to. This is gonna be an interesting video because I personally feel like I made my case already. In my own video on my own channel when the episode came out, I don't know what I could possibly add, sort of just my experience with this episode. So I think this is mostly from my end just going to be responding to Lucy's feelings about it because I know she didn't like it much. Oh, that she thought the frog was silly. But outside of those two things, I don't think you've given like comprehensive thoughts on this episode.
It's just very, very meh to me, with a few okay moments and stuff, and one really. I will get into the ending when we get to that. I did not like the ending. Not just because of the frog thing. It was also other things according with that. But yeah, it's just for me. This was just a very meh episode. And when I see like you and other people like saying like, "Oh, it was a masterpiece" and stuff like that, I'm just like, yeah.
I don't think this episode reaches masterpiece status until the final third. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is a case where it's very much whether or not the episode sticks to the landing for you. Because the first two thirds of it, I think, are still really, really good. If the last third was the quality of the first two thirds, I think this would still be second or third best episode of the series.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would still be very good, a highlight, but it's mostly intrigue, just being along for the ride and slowly unraveling what's going on. And then all of that provides context to the real emotional punch, which is the climax. If you're not fully invested, or if the last third doesn't do it for you, then that retroactively stops the first two thirds from being as interesting as they could have been.
The first two thirds I thought it was kind of meh. And then the last third I was like, no, just no.
Because I'm interested to know what it is that gets to you beyond just the frog visual. But I will say, of the first two thirds, I know that you and others have sort of like a thing with ribbons and just the anti zone and that whole section of the episode being kind of fillery.
Mm-hmm.
And I won't necessarily disagree with you. Is there like a version of reality where you can rewrite this episode without those elements in it and have it still function about the same? I think so. But at the same time, I feel like the episode would be losing something if you got rid of him because he's just so effectively creepy and weird. And I will continue to make comparisons between episodes in this series and episodes in the classic show.
Mm-hmm.
The classic show would do that sometimes, where you would have a whole character or a subplot that doesn't really contribute to the main plot, but it's just effective, and the episode would be, and the story would be worse for not having it. And I feel like that's what this is. Every line that came out of that guy's mouth just makes me shudder. He's so odd, and I love when he's on screen.
My thing about anti-zone is not so much the zone itself, but ribbons and everything and the moss. It feels a little on the fantasy side. He
Mm.
feels like something I would see in Buffy. Is my problem. It's like I feel like I would see this creature in Angel or Buffy, and the two tones for me in Doctor Who, it's not mixing well. Or do they explain where he came from?
They outright say he was born in the anti-zone, which is like my one actual problem with the episode is that that feels lazy to me.
Yeah.
Is like he needs to be there so that he can explain that what the anti-zone is and that the fact that the anti-zone is where they are so that when the doctor hears that word she recognizes it and she's like, oh, an anti-zone, and that means this and this. Someone has to provide some exposition, and you can't just get rid of the anti-zone because it's kind of important to the that he was born there, and I guess all the rat things were born there too. I'm not gonna say it doesn't make sense, because the anti-zone is just a thing that the universe springs up whenever it wants to. Sure, things can be born there, time is whatever, turns all at once. It's not an issue of being need to be explained more. It's just it feels convenient.
Yeah, it feels convenient, and also, I mean, this might be because of just the way I believe in things and stuff. I just don't feel like the universe would just like make these creatures in this anti-zone. It reminds me a lot like the Father Day episode. That's why I have a problem with like the gargles or whatever you call them. There's a
Called the Reaper.
yeah, the Reaper. I feel like if the universe is going to have a problem like that, it's either, like I said, it's going to make some kind of separation and that's it. It's not going to make like creatures and things like that, or it's just going to fall apart on itself like it did in the Big Bang. It just seems like a more realistic portrayal.
Maybe, but I don't know. Maybe it's just because of how much Big Finish I've been listening to.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm used to the universe and Doctor Who just doing weird, seemingly arbitrary stuff
Mm-hmm.
just when weird anomalies happen. We can assume that the Doctor Who universe has a level of sentience or self awareness or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
or if it's like an organism of some kind. I don't know. The universe in this show's like mythology is just so weird and abstract, and the rules change constantly, and I think that's part of the appeal, honestly.
I think that's also sometimes
But
where the problems comes in because like some eras take themselves more serious than other eras. Some are more, like I said, are strictly sticking to our rules of reality. Then you have other areas where it's like, they're making up their own rules. My thing about science fiction, I like hardcore science fiction and stuff, and there is an element in this episode that I like because it is hardcore sci-fi, the or not anti-universe, the living universe. To me, it gets lazy when it doesn't follow some kind of rules for the show, either by the show standard
mm-mm.
or by reality standard. Whatever your rules are for your show, you have to stick with them. And I don't, for the most part, this seemed like this was going to be like super realistic. And then they just put this in here and it feels more like a Russell T Davis thing. And I'm like,
I can completely understand that.
mhm.
On the other hand, I don't think Doctor Who has ever been the kind of show ever once since it started in 63. I don't think it's ever been the kind of show to be like hard about its rules. And
Mhm.
I'm perfectly fine with breaking those rules if it makes for a more compelling story.
Mhm.
So I don't know. It's a real case by case thing.
This is more in shows in general. I like them to stick to their established rules.
I think if we want realism in any sense from Doctor Who, it should be on a character level.
It's
Like, that's part of what I've been praising this series for, is that I feel like character dialogue and interaction is more realistic this series than it has been for a while on this show. When it comes to like plot stuff, it's like, how do you quantify realism for some of the stuff that goes on in this show? Like, we don't really know how the universe works. I
yeah,
don't think our comprehension of it is good enough.
yeah. I mean, I agree with that to a point, but some of it, I don't know. Like I said, maybe because it's just the way I go about life and stuff. I just don't think the universe will put something in there to, correct itself in a fantasy way.
I mean, I think part of what makes it feel like a fantasy and
Mm-hmm.
what I think is a strength to this episode, which is something that I haven't really
Mm-hmm.
thought of until you brought it up, is that this whole story has kind of a fantasy fairy tale vibe to it. When they first see Ribbons in the cave, like my and a lot of people's immediate reactions was that gives kind of like Lord of the Rings vibes with
Mm-hmm.
Schmeagol,
Yeah.
and he's very much a similar character to that. You've got kind of a Goldilocks vibe with like finding a little girl in a cabin in the woods, like Hansel and Gretel type thing. It feels like something out of a grim folk tale.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of ending with talking to a talking animal, like it's a frog. It's got kind of like the frog princess vibes. I don't know. There's a lot of fairy tale sort of fantasy motifs throughout this episode. At least in that respect, Ribbons being kind of the way he is, the whole explanation being kind of vague and fantastical. At least it's not out of place.
It feels more like a Lord of the Rings episode than it does a Doctor Who episode.
I guess. I don't know. A lot of this is I don't know how I would feel about this if I haven't been listening to so much Big Finish,
Mm-hmm.
which really likes to go back and forth between hard sci-fi and like really trippy, abstract, fantasy inspired stuff. Like, there's a whole audio story for the Eighth Doctor called Neverland, which is just a lot of fairy tale references, just kind of the Doctor and his companion being put in a lot of these weird, kind of fantastical scenarios that are like, this doesn't really feel like a science fiction thing at all.
Like I said, different viewpoints. How I view how the universe would handle things is probably different from Chuck Knowles or who wrote this one.
This one was written by Ed Hine or Pete McTeague. Hang on, let me check.
So we have some authentication.
I'd like to have a little bit of dignity in these things. Okay, yeah, Ed Hine wrote this one.
Well, Ed Hine has a different outlook on how the universe would fix itself. Uh,
At some point, you eventually just have to go, all right, even if I disagree with the mechanics of this, I kind of just have to go with it because that's what this story decided to be. Some level, I think once a story gives you a conceit, is like, you just have to accept this is true so that our story can work. At some level, you just kind of have to go with it. With the movie Inside Out, you just kind of have to go with your emotions are represented by these tiny little people in your head. Even if that's not how emotions work, it's something you just have to accept so that this movie can happen.
Depends on what you're watching too, though. Like I said, I am a fan of when they have like established rules. Like, okay, we're doing hardcore sci-fi. But anyway,
The mechanics here were definitely more in service of the character stuff and sort of getting us to the ending, which I guess brings us to, aside from the frog, what stuck to you about the ending?
my problem with the ending mostly becomes, first of all, it established that you can't have that much matter in this universe. And okay, all we have is the Doctor, and then it starts falling apart. And she said, I'm too much for the universe, but you're still the same amount of matter as the Father and stuff. And so it shouldn't matter, but okay, the universe just kind of lets her go because it's like, I promise to be your bestie. And I'm like, that's kind of a lame way to end that. Like, I wish it was a bit more powerful. Also, her explaining the universe, I felt like should have been like, I wanted that to be a powerful scene and stuff. I just felt like it was a bit underwhelming.
I can understand for some people needing that scene just to go on longer. I think it's personally just the right length. Like, would I like more of it? Sure, but I don't necessarily need more. The thing is, I think about the how much matter it can sustain and stuff like that. I just kind of take it as once it started falling apart, then like the entire thing just isn't sustainable. Their universe is being bridged by the anti-zone or like coming into close enough contact for that to happen. All of this was a fluke. None of this should have happened. It got lucky. And so being able to sustain one person coming in just as a result of this accident happening in the first place, fine. Then more people come in. It's breaking apart. The anti-zone's breaking apart. Just this whole link between the two of them isn't going to work anymore. So having one thing from one side stay on the other, just it's not gonna happen. Like, I can see a scenario where if Eric just stayed there and nobody came to look for him and he didn't go back and that it just stayed that way and nobody went through the mirror ever again, then things could just stay exactly the way that they were until like Eric died or something. But I think it's like balancing and it gets tipped on one side and it starts to fall over. And by the time it's just the frog and the Doctor, it's already fallen over and there's no fixing it.
Yeah, I guess you can look at it that way. It just felt like to me, like, okay, we need to get the Doctor out of there because, we can't have the Doctor stuck in an alternate universe with Kermit. And I think that scene would have been a bit more powerful if they use something besides a frog, something that would actually be personal to the Doctor.
You are not the only person to say that. So, like, what would you suggest, though? Because when people say that, they usually suggest, like, a past companion or something, and I have several reasons why I think that wouldn't work in the context of this episode. But, like, what specifically would you put in there?
I know this would sound strange, but I was actually put, like, the Doctor themselves in there. Like having her talk to herself. We could do something very interesting with that.
Yeah, if you mean having 13 talk to 13 themselves, also, that could maybe work. That's maybe the one thing that that's actually a good suggestion. but people who are like, have it be a past companion, have it look like Clara or Rose or Susan or a previous doctor or something, I think that would actually be a detriment to this episode, since I feel like anything that would rely on knowledge of previous series functions on its own outside of the Grace stuff. Really, you don't need anything other than what's in this series to enjoy this episode. That applies to every episode this series, but especially this one. The people who suggest, like, I don't know, make it something personal to the Doctor. That's, I think, alienating newer viewers. And also, at that point in the story, it's not trying to trick the Doctor. Like, the Doctor knows what it is. It doesn't need to, like, attract her to stay with it. So I think just having it be some random thing that it wants to be works better than it putting on another disguise for the sake of, like, okay, this will make sure that you stay with me.
Like I said, it doesn't need to trick her anymore because it's already got her in the trap. And also, it could have been a good acting moment for like Jodie and stuff because she's like talking to herself.
Maybe, but I think that moment is already a great acting moment for her.
To me, it was no better than the rest of her performances. That's not to say I'm saying that they're bad. I think they're all been pretty good.
I was captivated by her throughout that little speech that she gave.
I think the speech also didn't get me. I was like, eh.
I don't know, I just think it works because of the circumstance of, like,
Not disagreeing what she says, but I think Anna, I just felt like the speech was a bit underwhelming for me. For a bit more than, the world is, the universe is vast and wonderful, and I gave it up. And yeah, that's fine. But it's just a bit.
well, I mean, I'm talking about later on when she's talking about how the Solitract has to be on its own from now on. If we're just talking about, like, the scale and scope of the universe,
Yeah.
I'd have liked her to have a couple of more lines about, like, things that she specifically liked in the universe.
Yeah.
Part of me likes that she goes straight to what she liked most about it, and what she's going to miss the most is the people. The thing is, it's not a big bombastic speech. What is it in the ring back? Where he actually had big, grand speeches in that episode. But this isn't one of those. Like, the thing that works for me about this speech is just that it doesn't even play like a speech. She's trying to comfort someone who is basically being doomed to life alone, assuming that they don't die the moment she leaves. Maybe it's just the fact that I don't care about the fact that the frog looks ridiculous. Maybe the fact that it's a small animal actually helps, but I feel bad for the Solitract. Like, it has my sympathies. It spends eternity by itself, and then it gets to have, like, a couple of days of having someone else in its life, and then it has a friend for, like, a few moments, and then it's by itself again for all eternity. And the Doctor can just offer it some comforting words, and she's really trying. And I don't know, it hits me.
I did feel sympathy for it because, like you said, this thing has to be alone forever. It's never ending. It's always ongoing, and I do find interesting. And that's the stuff I enjoyed about the episode because it was more of a look at something abstract.
Yeah.
But like I said, everything else just didn't really do it for me.
And we should talk about Eric. Eric is the worst parent, and yet in being the worst parent, he makes this episode really interesting, even more so than it was, I think, because all the non-Solitract stuff that sticks out to me is just the ways in which he's terrible and how everyone reacts to that. Like, I mentioned in my own video the writing on the wall and how I think that's a really well done scene.
Yeah, that was nice.
And also, when Ryan finds out that he just recorded a bunch of noises, that's something that this show does sometimes, and that I wish it did even more often, where it's a little twist, but the ramifications are huge. Where, like, we spend, what, like a third, maybe 2/5 of this episode thinking that there's a big thing outside that's gonna get them.
Mm-hmm.
And then, no, it turns out, like, we spent part of this episode thinking that there's a monster, and now we have to rethink all of the episode up to this point because something that we thought was fundamentally true, it turns out was a lie. And because we're so used to, like, monsters in this show, it doesn't even occur to you. But then you're like, oh, I assume that there was sort of a force in this episode that doesn't actually exist. And that sort of throws me for a loop. Like, I was genuinely like, okay, what? Where is this going?
What a twist!
But yeah, like I like that scene at the very end when he looks at the wall and he kind of realizes what a horrible father he's been. Like,
Yeah.
wow, like I really messed up here.
I like that the episode doesn't excuse him because that is a conscious choice that he made that was genuinely horrible. But I like that the episode, without being like explicit about it, subtly explains it, where it's like it's just that his grief and just his response to it, moving away from town, moving away from civilization, being just the two of them in this cottage by themselves in the woods,
Mhm.
has screwed him up.
Mhm.
Like, just being away from people has not been good for either of them. And so I like that the resolution at the end is like, okay, we cannot be here by ourselves anymore. We have to go back to like Wi-Fi and friends and giving both of us like a chance to have a normal life with other people, because being by ourselves has kind of like screwed us up royally.
Yes. It is not good. As somebody that's been stuck in the house a lot lately, it is not good on the mental psyche. Grieving. It makes it all the worse.
It's great that we did that. Graham, being contrasted to Eric in this episode, looked back a little bit at arachnids in the UK, and part of that whole episode is Graham being like, no, you know what? I cannot be by myself in this house with my grief because that's gonna drive me nuts. That was the last time that he was visually seeing Grace, and now we're doing that again with this episode, and Eric is pretty explicitly, I think, like, okay, this is what could happen to someone like Graham if he didn't have other people to, like, ground him.
I can see that.
And, like,
Also, I think it's a really relatable thing that people don't really understand. When you try to be like the lone soldier all the time, especially if you're going through like a bad thing and stuff, you kind of it overcomes you and it gets worse and you lose yourself. And I do think that's a good message in there. Like, you need to move back to society, and it's not fair to your daughter either, as well. But
yeah, now that I think about it, that contrast actually works on multiple levels because we compare and contrast Eric and Graham in that way, and we also have Ryan and Hannah together through the whole episode,
mhm,
and Ryan is pretty much to Graham what Hannah is to Eric, and you contrast Eric, even knowing that he left his daughter alone,
mhm,
just cannot bring himself to leave his wife until the last possible second. And yet, Graham, by contrast, it's the fact that Ryan is in danger that like spurs him on, and like the fact that it's trying to hold him away from Ryan, where he's like, no, you know what, this isn't gonna work. I gotta get out of here. Ryan needs me. I really like that. I like what we do with those two pairs of characters. The more and more I think about it, it's really smartly done.
the whole Graham and Grace thing would have worked better for me. Her and I forget the other woman's name, the mom.
Trina?
Yeah, they started acting way too suspicious way too soon. I was like, yeah, these two are kind of putting off vibes of, like we're the evil twins or something. I'm like, when the doctor starts talking and she just like almost robotically, the mom goes like, this woman's absolutely mad. And I'm like, okay.
I didn't feel that way about that line read. I did think it was suspicious, but I didn't feel like it was robotic.
Evil there, like, oh, we're revealing that this is actually like a bad place or something. I'm like, okay, this is getting a little too suspicious, guys. Gran, wake up. It's very obvious. Wake up.
I don't disagree with you at all that that's happening, but
Mhm,
at the same time, I don't think that that's a problem because, again, that's part of just how the soul attract is desperate. Eric and Graham are already falling for it. It just wants the doctor and Yaz and everyone else to stop bothering it. It's an emotional, sort of universal creature, presence, whatever you want to call it.
mhm.
It's trying desperately to hold on to what it has. Yeah, that kind of compromises its ability to act natural.
Graham, like, not failing to pick up a little bit quicker.
I think he realizes they're acting off. I think he's just trying to ignore it. He outright says to the doctor, like, I know what you're asking me to do,
Hmm.
by which he means, like, reject it, admit that it's fake, and leave. He's
Hmm.
like, but I just can't.
Yeah.
So I think Graham beginning has his own suspicions. I think he understands implicitly that something is wrong, and yet at the same time, it's the closest thing he's ever gonna have to having Grace back, so he's just willing to put up with it.
Yeah, I can see that part of it.
Until it gets in the way of Ryan's life.
Yes. Also, that part I wish they'd done a little better because Ryan tells the little girl to run through the portal and said, I'll distract the moss. It's like, just run, dude. Just run in there. It's like they made it to where he had to be in danger. Make it to where, right when the little girl goes through the portal, the doctor loses control of the portal. Ryan, I don't know, hits the wall. That's all they had to do. I was like, damn it, why did you have to put a little bit extra silliness in there?
Maybe, but then that's immediately undercut when, like, not even a full scene later, like, it starts expelling people right back out. Like, within a couple of minutes, it's throwing Yaz and Hanne out, so that thing has to be open, and it's gotta be a two-way thing. Why close it when it's just gonna be opened up again?
Yeah, but they already closed it before. Like, what they basically indicated was it closes on her and she can't open it back up, but it can push everyone back out. The portal is closed. There's nowhere for him to go. He starts running around in circles trying to get away from the moss.
Is that not what happened, though?
Mhm.
Because if I remember correctly, Hanne says he's trapped in there with those things, which is another moment that I actually really like because she doesn't initially realize that he didn't come in after her. And when she realizes something is wrong and that it's not her mom, like her first response is to call out to him. Like, I really like that. I think this is getting into nitpick territory.
I know, but it's still stupid. Don't put the stupid stuff in there.
Like I said my piece. I did almost 30 minutes of this on my own channel, and that was after these videos had progressively been getting shorter. Say, to sum up, is just the experience that I had watching it, which is just that I was emotionally enraptured by it.
My emotions!
I have not felt this way watching an episode in a couple of years. Like, since Heaven Sent, and that was now over 3 years ago was that episode. It's hard to believe it's been that long, but it has been over 3 years.
But to be fair, the season in between that was pretty mediocre.
That's kind of my point.
Yeah.
Like, it's been a while since we've had a high point like this, I think.
Yeah. For me, meh.
Well, if you... Yeah.
I don't really have much negative to say about it, but I don't have much, like, enthusiasm for it. I wish I did, honestly. Because, like I said, I like the idea of the living universe. I really do. Like I said, the season's like last season for me. It's kind of meh.